The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors.
Welcome to Crime and Justice Radio, where we talk all things crime, justice, mayhem, and the courts with expert insiders and legal outcasts. My name is Aida Leisenring, and I'm here with co-host Bruce Barket. Happy belated 4th of July.
Happy 4th to everyone. Great weekend. Unfortunately, it's not hazy, hot, and humid the way I'd prefer it, but we take what we get.
We are going to talk about today different shades of freedom through 3 different stories. We are, in a sense, one of the freest countries in the world. Ironically, however, we incarcerate more people in the land of the free than anywhere else in the world. 2.3 million people are locked up. So today we have 3 stories that reflect on the dynamics of prison in the criminal justice system.
Excellent. And the high rate of incarceration here continues to be a theme that we'll touch upon. And it's one of these things that kind of aggravates me. But let's talk about our guests and what our topics for today.
Shortly, and I'm very excited about this, we have Brian Perry, who we know and have worked with in Pennsylvania, who recently secured the freedom of America's favorite dad to some, Bill Cosby, who walked out of prison last Wednesday. We're also going to talk about Leonard Forte, who's kind of a local story that's been ongoing for 25 years. He was a former Suffolk County police officer that was convicted of raping a 12-year-old girl, but remained free for 25 years after a new trial was ordered because he claimed to be too sick to stand trial. So we're doing a little story about a man who enjoyed freedom under false pretenses.
Well, and we should say, when you say it's a Long Island story, he was actually prosecuted in Vermont.
Yes.
And that's where he has new charges facing him now. But the his victim was and still is, a resident of Long Island. He was a Suffolk County detective, and he went on a trip to Vermont and took one of his daughter's friends and raped her in Vermont.
And now he's being charged with obstruction of justice, and we'll explain why. And lastly, we're going to hear from Mario Chavez, a man whose freedoms have been entirely stripped away, at least for the last 17 years. He will be calling in from prison in New Mexico to explain what the conditions are like, and he claims he's innocent.
This is an interesting person who reached out to us based upon our show, and we're going to put him on and see what he has to say.
But first, I'd like to report that last Wednesday, John Hummel, a former Marine who was honorably discharged with service-related trauma, was executed in Texas for killing his wife and father-in-law. He was accused, but oddly not prosecuted, for killing his 5-year-old daughter. Now, why am I talking about this today? 4th of July represents our independence, but it wouldn't have been made possible without brave soldiers risking their lives for our freedoms, and these soldiers witnessed their comrades being killed in battle, and they fought in war, and a lot of them come home and they have post-traumatic stress disorder, and the U.S. has sought the death penalty against many former veterans who came back after fighting abroad and clearly did not get the economic, medical, and mental health relief they so much needed and deserved. And in this particular case, his trial attorney never introduced evidence of his service to the country and how that impacted his brain and contributed to the crime. So rest in peace, John Hummel. Thank you for your service, and sorry to you and to your victims, your family, because perhaps if we had taken care of you the way this country should have, neither of you would be dead right now.
Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service.
So let's get to our next guest, Brian Perry. He is a spectacular lawyer, and he's extremely humble about it. He is a shareholder at Tucker Arsenberg and a practicing lawyer in Pennsylvania. He's one of the most talented, preeminent, yet humble defense lawyers in Pennsylvania or in America. And
he's going to have trouble maintaining that humility based upon his most recent win.
Due to his efforts, he has obtained and secured the freedom and permanent sealing of Bill Cosby's case. Do we have Brian on the line?
You do.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Hello, Brian. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
How does it feel?
I was running around in court yesterday like a chicken with my head cut off, and I got the email from the Supreme Court with the decision, and it felt it's impossible to put into words because I've been involved in this for over 2 years and have met, I've talked to Mr. Cosby and our whole team time after time after time. We always thought this is how it would end, but it was surreal. I had a busy afternoon, and I just said to my secretary, cancel everything. I'm going to prison to pick him up, and I was shaking. It felt like a little kid coming down the stairs at Christmas. Christmas morning. That's what it felt like.
Yeah. Look, for people who haven't been through it, it really is as dramatic as you can imagine. But this on drama on steroids, because this is Bill Cosby, national figure. Everybody is stunned. Everyone has an opinion about it. What was the core? What was the core legal justification for this dismissal?
So we did the first level of appeals in the Pennsylvania Superior Court. We raised, I think, 11 or 12 issues. Denied. The oral argument was not fun, and you could just tell from the tone and the types of questions we were getting. The interesting part was the Supreme Court, the highest court in PA, took two issues. They took the issue that they actually reversed and discharged on, which was the pre-existing agreement from the prior district attorney, Bruce Castor. But we thought the issue that really had teeth was what's called 404B evidence, similar crimes witnesses. They're not victims; they're witnesses of signature crimes. In trial number 2, the trial judge allowed the alleged victim, Ms. Constantine, to testify, and then 5 404B witnesses. And any normal person, by the time they hear 6 different people testifying, I don't care who the trial lawyers were, there's no chance of an acquittal. So we always said that was the fundamental unfairness, and we thought that they were going to reverse and remand on that issue.
And just to be clear, the first jury didn't have those witnesses. There was a pretrial ruling that they weren't admissible, and he got a hung jury just to show how prejudice actually works in real life.
Right. Here's the thing that bothered me more than anything. Trial number 1, alleged victim testifies, and the judge let 1 404B witness in, just 1. Jury hangs. I don't know what the split was. Word is it was like 7-5 not guilty, but I don't know that for sure. I didn't do the trial. It was an outstanding lawyer from Philly named Brian McMonigal was the lead lawyer. Trial number 2 replaces the Cosbys replaced McMonigal with a whole new crew of lawyers, and they were outstanding lawyers. But the problem is the judge, same trial judge, in trial number 2 allowed 5 404B witnesses. And that more than anything bothered me. Make it fair. And that's what I've said now over the last 2 days to lots and lots of people who've asked me. Our role is to make it fair, to make sure that it's done right. If it's done right, it's done right. We'll deal with the consequences. This was not right, and it never felt right. And thank goodness the Supreme Court agreed.
But they overturned basically on the pre-existing deal, so to speak, that Castor, who, I love this fun fact, was Trump's impeachment lawyer, made with essentially Bill Cosby and his team of defense lawyers. And I remember, even as a lawyer, I wasn't paying attention, but I said, why in the world would Bill Cosby subject himself to a deposition and make admissions that could impact his criminal trial? But I wasn't aware about that agreement between the prosecutor and the defense. And the court called this an unconstitutional coercive bait and switch. Was that your language that the court adopted?
So my partner, Barb Zemlock, wrote that issue. Our brief was written by her. I mean, we all participated and edited. Jennifer Bonjean, who's a phenomenal lawyer, did the oral arguments on both issues. But Barb Zemlock wrote this issue, and as we, you know how appellate work goes, it's so tedious, and we went through every word and every line. And as we went through the editing process, I would look at her and say, "This has teeth, Barb. This is real." In essence, what Castor said was, there is not enough evidence. This is in 2005. There's not enough evidence to convict Bill Cosby on Ms. Constand's allegations. There were too many holes, okay? And you know what? He was right. You know how he was right? Look what happened in trial number 1, when it was basically just her. They could not reach a unanimous verdict, and that's exactly what he predicted. And he did it in a funky way, though. He tells the criminal defense lawyer, it's done. He will never be prosecuted. And he signaled, he knew that there would be a civil suit coming, and he knew then that Mr. Cosby couldn't assert his Fifth Amendment privilege at a deposition. And here's the other crazy part of the case. You do realize what he said in the deposition had nothing to do with Ms. Constant. He was asked, "Hey, did you take Quaaludes in the 60s and 70s? Did you ever provide them to women?" He goes, "Yeah, everybody did." And if you
not everybody, but go ahead.
Check this out.
Almost everybody.
Go on Google and Google Quaaludes and Coke.
Yeah, I grew up in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
A billboard will pop up, and it's a Coke. It's a Coke ad that says Quaaludes and Coke. We almost inserted it as a footnote in our brief to say this was the party drug for many people back then. He never said, "I drugged and raped anybody." He said, "Yeah, we used to pop them like candy." That's what we did back then. But they spun it in trial, and they used that, and that's what the Supreme Court hung their hat on. They said he may or may not have submitted to that deposition testimony, and they used it against him. And what is the most unusual part of this is they didn't remand for a new trial. They discharged and vacated and said it was so fundamentally unfair. And that's the unusual part of it.
And I quote, they said, any future prosecution on these particular charges must be barred.
Exactly.
So that's unheard of almost.
That's everybody who does appellate work, you get a reversal, and you always know that, look, that's a good win. You're back in the position you were in before you got convicted.
Right.
But Bill Cosby's better off. It's like the jury said not guilty. He's done forever.
Yep. Right. And he's off of Megan's Law, and he could, he'll be 83 or 84 next week.
He's not a registered sex offender for the rest of his life. And how's he doing?
It's all gone.
What was it like?
Oh, it was. I'll never forget it. It was just. I was just happy for all of them, and he wanted to lay down in his bed and take a deep breath and get out of the prison garb, and just he was happy, and
But walk us through it. Talk to people about walking into a prison and walking out with your client.
So, I'm in prisons all day long, every day. And it is, it's not what you see on TV. This is a state penitentiary. He was in with people who have committed and been convicted of many, many, many crimes, all types of crimes. He was in a cell by himself, and he's legally blind. He basically has no sight. So can you imagine? I tell people, close your eyes and think about being in a prison and having no sight. Can you imagine at his age? And so they treated him very well in terms of his care there. But then walking out after 3 years, he's been in there for 3 years, and to see him get in a car, and he just was tired. He wanted to go home and take a nap and take a deep breath, but he was happy. We walked him up to his bedroom, and he laid down and took a little nap, and then came out, and we addressed the media and hugged, and he was very, very thankful. He said to me yesterday, he called me doctor. He always called me, every time I saw him, he called me doctor. Doctor, you told me two things when you met me. And I said, what did I tell you? He said, you told me I'll never lie to you, and this appeal has teeth. That's what he said to me yesterday. And I said, yeah, I guess I'm not as dumb as I look.
That is fantastic.
And seeing you, by the way, because when I saw the headlines and clicked on the images, seeing you next to him and Miss Bonjean and his whole team, it was really just amazing. I don't know what those 3 years were like for him.
Right.
I hope he was, you mentioned he was well taken care of. I hope that's the case.
Let me tell you something about him that people don't know. He lectured inmates in there on choices and good decisions and changing lives, just like he did his entire life in trying to lift people up. he did it in the prison. And I have a friend of mine who's works for the prison system, and the feedback was amazing. He never sulked. He never felt sorry for himself. He refused to do the treatment program, the counseling. He said, I'm not going through counseling for something I didn't do. And he held his ground. And they denied his parole a week ago because he wouldn't go through the counseling. He held his ground. He said, I am not, he dug his heels in and said, I will never go through that counseling because I didn't do anything wrong.
And what counseling you're talking about is they force people in prison. They don't force them, but they say you're a sex offender. You have to go to sex offender counseling. And then, as you pointed out, that gets counted against you or for you when you come up for parole. And so when he said, I'm not going through the counseling, he knew that meant he wasn't going to get parole.
I said to him, he got 3 to 10 years, 3-10. In Pennsylvania, that means he got 10 years in prison with the ability to be paroled at 3. The parole board decides your fate. They take into consideration victim impact, prosecutors' statements, and successful counseling. If they tell you you have to do this program, you will not come up for parole. You will not see the light of day unless you do what they tell you to do. And on his denial of his parole, it said, fair to complete recommended counseling. That's what it said. So he would have done 10 years in prison. He would never have been paroled.
Good thing he had a great lawyer, a team of lawyers that got him the heck out of there before the time passed.
Brian, thank you so much for coming on our show. And I know that you did this, literally just stepped out of a courtroom to make this call. So we're so grateful. Keep up the fantastic work. And
I appreciate it.
And
thanks
talk
for
to you
coming
soon.
on. We'll talk to you again. Take care.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Wow. Really is an incredible feeling to have that happen. So he did a great job for him. And for people who think Cosby somehow got away with this, remember what he just said. He did 3 years in prison, and he paid $3.5 million or close to $3.5 million to the complainant.
That's right. Now let's talk about the reversal of that. Leonard Forte, who is a former Suffolk County police officer who was tried and convicted of raping a 12-year-old girl. But the prosecution, as you mentioned earlier, Bruce, happened in Vermont because that's where the summer house was that his daughter's friend invited the victim to. And a jury found him guilty. And rather than being sentenced, his case was overturned because the prosecutor was, according to the higher court, too emotional. And this was in the 80s where women weren't allowed to be emotional. And he, instead of being retried, said, I'm too sick to stand trial. And he was living in Florida at the time, and he kept submitting medical reports saying that he was basically dying in 5 minutes from hospice. But over the last 25 years, he's been taking road trips, going to Home Depot, going to McDonald's, getting a cup of coffee.
Living a pretty good life.
For 25 years. Meanwhile, the victim has waited 25 years for justice. And what recently happened?
Well, he made some comment that I've been dying for 25 years, and this story is followed by, has been promoted and followed by Gus Garcia, a writer for the Washington Post who now does sports writing for the Washington Post, but wrote about Mr. Forte. And the Vermont prosecutors have now indicted him or charged him with obstruction of justice for pretending to die for 25 years and stopping the trial from happening. So
we're going to follow that trial as it occurs, and possibly the rape trial that's still pending now, the retrial in Vermont. But it really is unbelievable that he was able to.
It's avoided justice for 25 years, but it sounds like it's coming around to get him. So let's talk about our next guest, Mario Chavez.
So normally we don't do a long introduction, but he deserves one because, frankly, not a lot of people have heard about him. Mario Chavez was convicted approximately 17 years ago in 2006 of murder in the first degree in the death of real estate agent Garland Taylor. He was sentenced to life plus 25 years. I wonder how that works out. And he says he's innocent, and his attorneys have reached out to us, and They claim that he actually has a viable case of actual innocence. But it's a complicated case, and what we're going to talk to him about really is what it's like to have your freedoms stripped away for 17 years. Mario will be calling from inside of the prison that he's housed to tell us what it's like to live in there.
What it's like to live in there, and why he thinks he's innocent and why he deserves, in his view, to get out. Some of the work that we do obviously involves wrongly convicted individuals. We've represented a number of them. I'm very interested to hear from Mr. Chavez and see what he has to say right after the break. And this will be our first call. We've been doing the show now for a couple of months. This will be our first call from inside a prison. And for whatever reason, it's a prison in New Mexico where we actually did some work a few years ago down in Las Cruces. Enjoyed our trips there. So we'll hear from Mr. Chavez in just a few minutes right after these commercial breaks. Got to pay the bills. Talk to you in a minute.
Welcome back to Crime and Justice Radio. I'm Aida Leisenring, and I'm here with Bruce Barket. And we have a very exciting guest on the line, two guests.
It'll be interesting. Mario Chavez and his attorney, Jason Bowles. Mario is incarcerated in the state of New Mexico for a murder. He was given life without parole and plus 25 years.
And he's currently in Northeast New Mexico Correctional Facility. And his lawyer, Jason Bowles. Welcome, Mario. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
So, Mario, how you making out?
I am trying to make the very best of a horrible situation.
And when you say you're trying to make the best, I've read some of the things that you've published or had published on your behalf, and you talk about life in prison. Can you give our listeners some idea of what it's been like to be in a prison for 17 years?
Well, it's like stepping into an alternate reality. The best way I can describe it, it's kind of hard for people to understand the kind of things that we face in here, but it's kind of like having to enter into some kind of dream world where you leave your identity, all that you've ever identified as you, and you leave it at the door, and then you walk into this place where you're expected to sort of adapt a new you and become a different version of you, and often that becomes required of you just for reasons of survival.
And what do you mean survival? You mean literally physical survival?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the physical. I mean, that's definitely an aspect. But I mean, I'm speaking more of the aspect of mentally being able to cope with the reality that you're seeing. Because, I mean, I think most people can relate to this who've been incarcerated, is that you're being stripped away from everything that is you. I mean, your career, your family, your children, all of your loved ones, and you're being stripped away from all that. And now that's no longer you. And especially when you're in a situation of a wrongful conviction, I mean, I think it's hard to accept that, because I think people who know that they did what they did, and they kind of find it easier to accept a reality of incarceration. Not all of them, but some of them. And I think in a situation where you know every fiber of your being knows that you didn't do something, sometimes you resist it more. I mean, I've never actually allowed myself to become the alternate me that they want me to become. And I think there's lots of psychological torment. I mean, the first 3 years of my incarceration, they had me in solitary confinement, even though I had no misconduct. I mean, I was actually classified by their own classification system. I was classified to be in general population because of my education, because of my age. That's where I should have been. But every 3 months, they would override me just to keep me in solitary confinement to see if they could break me. I mean, it becomes sort of like a game.
3 years. 3 years in solitary confinement.
People don't know what that means. It means you're literally locked in a cell for 23 hours a day. And prison is prison. There's gates and bars and cells. But for the most part, people during the day inmates have jobs or classes. They move about somewhat freely within a confined space to do different things. Solitary means you're just sitting in a cell day in and day out.
Exactly. I mean, there was no, and even when you come out shackled at the feet, shackled on your hands, and your recreation is in a cage not much bigger than your cell. And everything is, the cage you're shackled to go to the shower, you're shackled to use the phone call, you're shackled for everything.
And how often were you permitted to leave your cell during that period of solitary confinement?
Just for recreation, Monday through Friday, 1 hour a day. But a lot of times the officers didn't like having to take us out, so they would call recreation at sometimes 3:30 or 4 in the morning, in the hopes that people wouldn't go, and they would refuse their rec. And so a lot of times, if it's wintertime and they're not going to give you a jacket, some people would choose not to go out.
So what you said before reminds me of a statement that was made by a client of ours who was incarcerated for 17 years and actually got out and was exonerated. He's a practicing lawyer now. But he said, they put me in prison, but they never put the prison in me. I wouldn't allow that to happen. And your comment about maintaining your integrity, your own self-integrity, is very similar.
Can I ask, before you were incarcerated, you said you were stripped away of your family and loved ones. Who is your family and loved ones? Did you have mom, dad, wife, kids?
Yeah, I had a daughter, wife. I had my mother, my grandmother, a half brother, grandmother who practically raised me. So I had people. I didn't have a very large family, but I did have people. I mean, the hardest thing for me to lose was probably my daughter. I mean, I think the first nights of being in jail, I mean, that was like a broken promise to her, because we had just a few weeks prior had this big shopping day at the mall in Scottsdale, and she was crying because she told me that she had a dream that I was in the ocean and I couldn't get to her, and she was making me promise over and over again that promise me you'll never leave. And when I thought about that at the time, I promised her because I had no reason to think, well, why would I leave you? And then when I'm sitting in the jail cell, and the reality of these charges are sitting in, and I'm realizing,
wow,
my God, this guy that I thought was my friend is actually going to save himself at my expense, and the police believe him. And I would just lay on the concrete floor, and you feel like the whole weight of the place is just kind of coming down on top of you.
And how old was your daughter at the time? We're going to get into the facts of your case, but how old was your daughter?
She was 6, so she's in her early 20s. I think she's 22 now.
And do you still maintain a relationship with her? How has it been being in prison? And
yeah, so she was taken by her maternal grandparents, and they raised her. And apparently, they wanted nothing to do with me, and they apparently told her that I was deceased at one point, and then she learned the truth when she was older, and she wrote me, and she was just very disappointed, and she felt like I didn't do enough to get to her. And of course, she wasn't aware of all that I had been doing, and every lawyer or every letter I'd ever written to try to get out of this situation, but all she could see was that I had failed her. I wasn't there when she most needed me. And so, that's kind of become one of those wounds that I don't think they ever really heal. I think it sort of stays with me, and maybe I don't even want it to heal at this point, because maybe carrying that wound is sort of like a piece of her.
And I'll tell you this, because a lot of people don't realize this. I participated in the exoneration of Barry Gibbs, who was exonerated and lived a very happy, exciting 10 years after his exoneration. We became close friends. I had been interning at the Innocence Project at the time, and I was a very, very young lawyer and naive. And so when he was exonerated and his case was splashed all over the New York Times, and there was all this press about it, I naturally assumed that his son, who is now in his 30s, a grown adult with children himself, would embrace his father and continue their relationship. But it had been so strained by prison, and it had been so complicated by that his son didn't immediately jump to his father's arms. And I found that so strange, but I've since learned that it's actually quite typical. Even if the individual child is convinced of their parents' innocence, the relationship is strained. And the good news is, over the course of the 10 years that he lived after exoneration, rest in peace, Barry Gibbs. I loved him to death, and he was one of the most magnetic, interesting people. But over the course of the 10 years, he became very, very close and reunited. And the scars did heal to the extent that they could be father and son again.
That's what we hope for people that are incarcerated, wrongly or not. When they get out, they can rebuild their relationships with their family. Mario, take us through to the extent that you can. I know that your lawyer's on the phone as well. And what's the status of your cause legally to be exonerated?
Well, right now, the New Mexico Supreme Court just denied this week a motion for reconsideration on the constitutional issues. I think a lot of people think that when you're wrongfully convicted, you can just go to the court and say, I'm innocent. But really, you have to have some kind of new evidence, or you have to have a constitutional violation that took place that made your trial unfair. And, my issue was had really fallen into that second category, because outside of the actual murderer coming forth and confessing what he had done, there's not really any new evidence to bring forth. And my issue on the second part of there is very serious constitutional violations that took place in my trial, in that I wasn't allowed to confront my accuser. That's just a huge fundamental Sixth Amendment, you have a right to confront your accuser, and that was denied me. So
let's stop there for a second so people know what you're talking about. Jason, you're still on the line, yes?
Yes, I am.
So when he says confront his accuser, there's another individual who the evidence points to as the potential or as the murderer, and that individual ended up providing information to the police. Did that person testify against Mario?
Yeah, and that is what happened. He did not testify. The court allowed him to not testify and invoke his privilege against his own incrimination. And so Mr. Chavez was unable to cross-examine him.
Okay, so your line, for whatever reason, is breaking up just a bit. But so what took place is that individual gave information against Mario.
He was the only alleged witness to the actual crime, and he didn't have to take the stand.
He didn't take the stand, but they used the information that he provided to police in written statements, introduced that in front of the jury, and his trial lawyer allowed that to happen. Is that what took place, Mario?
Well, it was the trial lawyer was objecting to the issue, and at the same time, the judge was kind of like, well, I'm going to let this happen for reasons of completeness. And there was lots of discussion back and forth, but my trial counsel never at any point did he say, I waive my client's Sixth Amendment right to confrontation. Actually, when you look at the trial transcripts, he actually said, I do not waive my client's confrontational rights. But he was in a situation where he's trying to cross-examine the detective, the lead detective in the case, and he was trying to point out to the fact that, look, you guys built your investigation off of what your first suspect told you, and you didn't even verify what the suspect was telling you was true, and you found him lying to you on numerous occasions. His story changed, and yet you continued on with this path of investigation. And my trial attorney was trying to bring this to the jury's attention that, look, he lied to you here, he lied to you here, and eventually, the judge is like, well, I'm just going to let all of the video statements that the man had given to the police, I'm going to let the jury see those videos in their entirety, which is like 4 hours of him just basically painting me as the worst villain in any Marvel comic book.
And just for the listener, because you know the intricacies of your case, and it deserves more than a 20-minute conversation, but the suspect who testified against you, who was the original suspect, there was evidence that he was at the payphone that was used to call to lure the victim in there. Meanwhile, you had a digital alibi that placed you at a different location. There was a bloody footprint that was a size 9, and he wore a size 9, and you wear a size 12. And he made other inculpating statements. So it sounds like the evidence against you was prejudicial, shouldn't have been admitted, and you definitely had huge violations of your constitutional right to confront your witnesses, and really the only witness to the alleged crime.
So where do you go from here? The Supreme Court in New Mexico has denied this. Do you have a federal habeas petition that's going?
Yeah, we have a federal habeas petition that's been pending, and that's the road that we're going forward on now.
And Mario, I want to also mention you have a podcast, which is really unique to have a podcast from inside of a prison where you talk about not just your issues, but the issues of other inmates. And I listened to it, and it was fantastic. And one of the things you said, which took me back, is a lot of people ask prisoners, what is it like? What have you witnessed? But you would never do that to a vet who came back from war. You wouldn't ask them, did you see any bodies blow up, right?
Yeah.
And that's true. And I'm going to make that mistake because I think a lot of people do think that prison is a walk in the park. And, you see movies, but you think they're just sensationalized and believe otherwise. People maintain friendships and walk around. If you don't mind educating our listeners, what are some of the scariest things that you've witnessed in prison?
I think some of the scariest things that I've witnessed has been just the violence that you wouldn't normally expect to see outside of Hollywood. I mean, like seeing someone's head smashed in with a door, and you can hear it, and it actually sounds like a melon. And it's just, and the officer will be standing right there, and he's just pretending that he doesn't see because he doesn't want to get involved. And this becomes a thing that you see so frequently, people getting stabbed through the neck with broomsticks or having their heads bashed in with rocks. I mean, just yesterday in a pod where I live, a guy was assaulted, and he's staggering to the door with blood coming down the back of his head. And, we're sitting there eating lunch, and this is just what's happening. And it's amazing because in any other place of the world, you would be like, my God, what is happening? I need to call 911 or I need to do something like this. And in prison, you don't do that. It's just normal reality of the situation, and you just go about your business because there's nothing really else you can do.
You've also talked about and written about drug incarceration, or the over-incarceration of drug addicts. Give us your thoughts on that.
Over the last 2 decades, especially over the last probably 15 years, there's been a situation where now you have 80 to 90% of the inmate population are seriously addicted to street drugs. And the department represents on its website that it's like 4% of the inmate population uses drugs. And I think that that's given a false narrative to the taxpayer, because the reality is it's much, much higher than that. And the administrators use this sort of drugging of the population as a way to keep inmates calm, right? If they're drugging themselves, then they're not bothering the staff. And since you've seen, ever since Governor Johnson back in the 90s opened up the doors to private prisons, you've seen the prison system in New Mexico turn from rehabilitative efforts to just warehousing. And so you only have maybe 10% of the inmate population that actually gets to work and do programming, and the rest are just put into these pods where they're left to their own devices. and they have no way of rehabilitating themselves, and a lot of them want to be. But the realities of the incarceration are so harsh on them that I think a lot of people fall down the rabbit hole of more criminality and more drug addiction. And then, I've written about this in a piece that I wrote called Monsters, Inc. back in May, where I'm saying, the system as it is today is basically just serving to monsterify more and more of the inmate population, and then release them into society, and then sort of use that as a talking point to tell the public, look, give us more money so we can keep you safe, and therefore monsterify more and more people and release them into society. And it's just horrible.
Look, we're going to have to let you go. Unfortunately, I love hearing you speak. Wish you luck. Hopefully, you come back and chat with us again as events warrant. Jason, good luck with this. Mario, you're an interesting individual. Keep up the good work, even from prison.
And keep up the podcast and educate people from the inside.
What is the podcast? We didn't tell them. What's your podcast?
Tell us the name, how you can find your podcast.
It's listed as the name as My Life Plus 25, which is also my website, and my Substack is mariochavez.substack.com.
Excellent. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mario, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Look, I loved our show today. I loved every part of it. Is it wrong for me to be thrilled and interested in?
I actually had, dare I say, fun.
Yeah, no, we had Bill Cosby's lawyer, a man from prison, and we completely forgot to give a nod to our firm, Barket, Epstein, Kieran, Aldea, and Laturco, www.barketepstein.com. You can reach us there or 516-745-1500. Now our partners will be happy that I gave the firm a little plug. Interesting topics. Mario Chavez is a real good guy.
He's an excellent speaker.
He's a good guy. I would be interested to see what happens to him. We'll be back again next week for another episode of Crime and Justice Radio.
See you later.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors. Or its sponsors. Or its sponsors. Or its sponsors. Or its sponsors.